So how did I get to Taiwan from Orlando? If you had asked me in high school where I would be in 20, 30 years, I definitely wouldn't have said China or Taiwan. I probably wouldn't even been able to tell you where Taiwan was or much about it, except for that stuff was made there. Because when I was a kid, everything was made in Taiwan. And China, I knew they had, the Great Wall, the Terracotta Warriors, Mao Zedong, and I liked Chinese food, and that was about it. And if you had told me I could speak Mandarin Chinese and Cantonese, no, that I wouldn't have believed you. So how did Dad get from Orlando to Taiwan? Let's call this part one. So when I was in high school, I wanted to work for the Walt Disney Company. That was going to be my life. I wanted to work for the Walt Disney Company. A lot of the people I grew up with and a lot of my friends, they had parents who worked for Disney, Walt Disney World, and they were Imagineers and managers and executives. Basically everybody in our town that I grew up in was an executive at Disney. So I just wanted to work for Disney. It was something I always was passionate about. So as soon as I got a chance and I was old enough, I went down and I applied for a job at Disney with my best friend at the time from high school. And I was 17 and I got a job in attractions when I was going from a junior to a senior in high school. So I became a Jungle Cruise skipper. That was my first job. And a story for another day is on the schedule for the day, next to my name, there was always this M1617 next to my name. And people would ask me, what does that mean? What does that mean, M16? I said, well, that's in case the guests get ruly. I can use my M16 skills to, crowd control. Anyway, so I was working at Disney, and that was my goal, was I wanted to become an executive or do something with Disney. So when it came time for me to go to college, all of the courses that I signed up for were either business related or international business related, because at the time Disney had a property in France. That was the only one that was more or less wholly owned by Disney. The one in Tokyo was not. So I thought that would be where I would go. So I wanted to take French. I took Spanish in high school and sucked at it. But I thought I'll do French because I need to learn the language and I'll become an executive at Disneyland Paris. I wanted to go overseas. I really liked traveling overseas and being international. So when I got to college, my classes were international business ethics, which I soon learned there is no such thing as ethics in business. It's mostly about how far you can get along with something until it's illegal, or how can you get away with it. Japanese history and Japanese cinema, and then small groups and leadership. Well, I went in thinking I would really like the business and the leadership stuff, and turned out I didn't like the business, as I said, about ethics, and the Japanese history stuff, which I didn't really know much about and thought it'd be just okay, I ended up really liking. Partly thanks to my mentor, who is a professor of anthropology, who was really amazing and took me under his wing, and I really appreciated that. So after that, the next semester I took classes on anthropology and more about East Asia, and I started to fall into love and interest with East Asia and with China and Chinese culture specifically. So I decided I would no longer be an international business major. I would instead become an anthropology major. And that's what I did. I majored in anthropology and minored in East Asian studies. And I started to take Mandarin, and I just really flourished in those areas in college. Disney, in the meanwhile, I was still working at Disney part-time on the weekends and summer vacations and things like that. But it started to slowly drift further away from my plans, because I thought, having talked to more and more people at Disney and seeing how the company had changed from when I joined in 2001 and from people who were there before, I just thought maybe that was not as viable of an option. Even though they had just opened Hong Kong Disneyland, or were going to open Hong Kong Disneyland a few years later, a year before my graduation, which I actually was there for the opening day of Hong Kong Disneyland, which was really cool as an exchange student. I took the day off. I skipped school. I played truant to go be at the grand opening of Hong Kong Disneyland, which I was actually filmed by the Associated Press as an interview subject for that. So my sick day, if they had ever watched the news that night, they probably saw me. But anyways, so I graduated from college, and I decided I wanted to go to grad school. I wanted to keep studying anthropology. But before I did that, I needed to really become fluent in Mandarin. So I left Florida and I studied in Beijing for a year. And I knew nobody in Beijing really. I didn't have any friends, I didn't have any contacts. I did have some friends in Hong Kong. So before I went to Beijing, because I did that study abroad in Hong Kong, in my last year in college, I went to Hong Kong for a month or so, and then I went to Beijing. And thankfully, my friends in Hong Kong set me up for, I think, a few days. No, they set me up for a few days at a dorm on the campus of where this program was taking place. And they had two schools. One school hadn't opened yet, and that was inside the inner ring road in the hutongs of Beijing. And the second academy, the second language institute, was outside in a more commercial business area, which I wasn't interested in. I wanted to be more closer to the center of the city and more the old, ancient, the cultural areas of the city. So that first probably 3 or 4 weeks before that second campus opened, I was in this dorm room. I had a dorm mate. He was Turkish. I never saw him. I saw him, I think, one time, and he was a very friendly guy, but he was always out partying and clubbing and things, and I wasn't into that scene. So I was in Beijing alone by myself, and I knew nobody. And I remember the first night I arrived in Beijing, I was laying in bed. There was no air conditioning, and I thought it was a hotel, but it wasn't a hotel. It was like a dorm, and I didn't even have a towel. I just had a washcloth, and I had just taken a shower, and I couldn't even take a shower because you had to pay for the water. You had to have an IC card. You had to go to the front desk, put money on the IC card, and then go back and use the shower. So you had to be very careful with how much water you used, or you would run out of money. So I was really thrown into the deep end. But I remember laying in bed, not knowing anyone or anything. Just my Chinese at the time was very minimal. And laying in bed, being bitten by mosquitoes because it was the middle of summer, and there was like a retention ditch outside the dorm, this dorm place, thinking like, what in the hell am I doing here? Did I make a big mistake? Well, a month later, I ended up transferring to that other campus once it had opened towards the inner part of the city, and I stayed at a hostel over in the Hutong area, and I lived there for a year and enjoyed my time learning Mandarin. But at that time, all of the popular media in China basically came from Taiwan. It was like Zhou Jielun, Jay Chou, SHE, Wang Lihong. It was all these Taiwanese singers, Mando pop. And a lot of the television that you would see in Hong Kong, like on Channel V, there was this television program called Hei She Hui. And I remember seeing that show in Hong Kong and thinking, this is really odd. It was like they were speaking Mandarin, but it felt very Japanese to me. And so, because all this popular culture that was in China and it was in Hong Kong, that was Mandarin, was all coming from Taiwan. So I thought, well, after my year in Beijing, which I became really fluent in Mandarin at that point, I'm going to go spend a year in Taiwan. And so I applied for Taiwan University for their language program there, and I was accepted. So I was really ecstatic about that. Again, I didn't know anybody in Taiwan though. One of my friends and dorm mates from college was Taiwanese, but he didn't live in Taiwan. He was a Taiwanese American. And so I knew nothing about Taiwan really outside of what I had read, and I had read a ethnography about it. And that was like from the 1960s or 70s. So I knew nothing about Taiwan. I didn't know anybody in Taiwan. And so I, again, went home to Orlando for a month or two, worked at Disney. I was still working at Disney. At that time, I was in guest relations, though. And that part will come into play later. And so I went back home, worked, and then I took off for Taiwan. But before I left Beijing, my teacher there, her name was En Lao Shi, like an Enda, and she was Manchu. She was Manchurian. And I remember she was so upset that I was leaving Beijing. Maybe being a bit cynical now, looking back on it, maybe it was because it was business related. I hope not. But she was an older woman, but she drilled me so hard. All the teachers there really drilled me hard. And thanks to them, my Mandarin became much better. But she was in tears about me leaving Beijing to come to Taiwan. And she was like, oh, they don't speak Mandarin in Taiwan. You'll have to study a whole new language. It's completely different. She's like 他们那边讲的国语跟我们的普通话不一样啊。This is different. You won't understand anything they say. 你什么都听不懂啊。And then she was so upset, crying that I was wasted. Oh, 你白学了, you wasted all your time studying over here to go to Taiwan. But I was committed. That's what I wanted to do. The ironic thing was that the place I was studying in Beijing was called the Taipei Language Institute. So, yes, from college, becoming interested in originally thinking I'd be a Disney person, and business, to anthropology, thanks to my professor, to East Asian studies, to China, to Beijing, study Mandarin to become more fluent, and then to Taiwan to study more Mandarin and become even more fluent. And that's where we'll stop today. Part 1, from college to China to Taiwan. And then next time we'll continue from stories in Taiwan. All right? See you next time.